Hello, this is your host, Austin Hopkins, and welcome to the Introvert Leader Podcast. Welcome to the podcast. Hope you're doing well today. We're going to be chatting about accountability. So we're going to be jumping into why I think accountability is so important. We're going to define it, give you some strategies to start holding your team accountable if that's what you're struggling with. So you're definitely going to get a lot of value around accountability today. But before we jump into that, I want to give you a quick update on what I've been into recently. Okay, music-wise, my wife introduced me to someone called Camila Cabello. I'm probably saying her name wrong, but super popular artist. Not really on my radar though. Up until about a month ago, she had this new album that came out, and me and my wife have been listening to it quite a bit. I really enjoy the song Boat, Best of All Time. That one's really good. I Love It is another good song. I'm Pretty When I Cry. That's another really good song. So I like her energy. I think she has some interesting producing on the tracks. I also like that she's doing some interesting sampling as well. So if you haven't checked her out, I would recommend it. I think you'd enjoy it if you're into that kind of pop, style music. YouTube content. So I've been watching this guy's channel, Dr. Eric Berg, for probably the last 8 years. And I heard about him after my good friend Kyle, who was on the podcast last week, or a couple of weeks ago, introduced me to the idea of fasting. I'd never really fasted before. So I decided to kind of check out his content and really, really enjoyed it. And he talks about nutrition and fasting and disease prevention. And, he introduced me to the concept of fasting and why it's so important and all the benefits. And so I kind of started fasting when I really was introduced to Dr. Eric Berg's content. And in fact, I'm just coming off a fast, one of my longer fasts right now. I think it's about a 44 hour fast. And I feel great. So, this is a little plug as well. If you haven't tried fasting, I think you might enjoy it. I will tell you at first, it's a little weird to get your head around the idea of not eating food. It's so ingrained to our culture and just who we are as humans that you eat, 3 square meals a day or et cetera, depending on where you're at. But that's just not what you have to do. You don't have to eat 3 meals a day. You don't have to eat 6 meals a day. In fact, you can just skip eating altogether sometimes, and it comes with amazing benefits. So if you haven't checked out his stuff, definitely recommend you do so. I think you'd get a lot of value out of checking out Dr. Eric Berg. Okay, I want to jump into what we're going to be chatting about today, which is accountability. So why are we chatting about accountability? So I'll tell you, I used to fear holding my team accountable. I thought it was awkward and uncomfortable. And I figured if people were adults, they should just come to work and do the right things, right? Pretty simple. That's how I was taught. And I figured most people were like that. And I shouldn't have to hold them accountable is what I used to think. But over time, I learned that accountability, what it really means and why it's one of the most important facets of leadership. So maybe you're a leader who's struggling with holding your team accountable. Maybe you're on a team where your boss doesn't know how to hold people accountable or how to set a standard. Or maybe you're new to leadership and you want to know how, why, and what accountability is. Whatever brings you here, I guarantee you're going to find value. So we're going to cover a couple things today, but I want to start by defining what accountability is and what accountability isn't. Sometimes there's some confusion around that, right? People don't know what it should look like and what it should feel like. So I want to break down what I believe accountability is and what it isn't. So here's what accountability is. It's setting clear expectations for each teammate. So letting them know, here's what I expect, here's how to do it, and making sure it's clear and that they understand it. It's giving your team autonomy. So accountability doesn't mean that I'm micromanaging. It's allowing my team that I hired to do the job that they were hired for. Super, super important. Accountability is also helping your employees become the best version of themselves. Most people think accountability is a negative thing. I want you to change your mind on this. I want you to change your thinking. Accountability is actually how you help people get better than where they were. So if they're not held accountable and there's no standards and there's nothing that they have to do and they can just get away with anything and do whatever they want and focus on whatever they want, do you think that's going to allow them to become better? Or if you channel that and make sure it's clear on here's what we need to do, here's the cool things we're working on, here's how it connects to what is important to you, you're going to see that employee becomes a better version of themselves. Accountability is approaching each employee differently. So that doesn't mean that I hold everyone on my team accountable the exact same way. Now, they may be accountable for the same things, the same behaviors and results, but the way in which they get there, that might look different, right? Because every employee is different. So if I just assume that treating every employee the same is going to get fantastic results, I'm going to be in a world of hurt because that's just not how it works. So again, it goes back to situational leadership and how important it is to adapt your style, your coaching, your accountability to the person in front of you. Okay, so that's what accountability is. Here's what it isn't. It's not micromanaging. You can be really good at accountability and holding your team accountable for expectations without micromanaging. And that's very, very important. So micromanaging is, for me, really showing my team that I don't trust them and that they don't have autonomy and that I have to babysit them. So that's not what accountability is. It's not babysitting. Accountability is not being rude. So sometimes people think that, gosh, accountability, it's so rude to the employee and, it's aggressive, but it doesn't have to be. It can be actually really casual and really collaborative. So it's not being rude. Accountability is also not making unrealistic expectations. So, I think we all have expectations as leaders and there's things that we want our teams to do, but we can go too far, right? We can have unrealistic expectations, and that's not what accountability is. I also don't think accountability is making your team feel bad, unsafe when they make a mistake. So let me just tell you this right now. Your team, even if you set expectations and you hold them accountable, they will make mistakes because we're humans, right? We all make mistakes. And you can choose to approach that in two different ways. You can make them feel bad when they make a mistake or have some psychological uncertainty about the future of their job. You can make it a big deal, or you can shrug it off, make sure that they're clear that that's not something that you want to see again, give them the tools to make sure that they're successful, and then let them do their thing. I think another thing that accountability isn't is it's not infrequent. So just saying what you expect one time and never following up, that's not accountability. That's just you saying something and hoping that your team picks it up. So accountability is consistent, right? And it's inspecting what you expect, which we'll talk more about later. Okay, so I talked a little bit about what accountability is and what it isn't. What I want to do now is kind of transition and talk to you about how to start holding your team accountable. So when you're just getting started with accountability, sometimes it can feel a little overwhelming, especially if you haven't done it before. And again, you may feel like it's a little awkward. You may feel like it's like a little uncomfortable. And for me, I even used to think that my team wouldn't like me if I held them accountable. I was wrong, of course. So what I thought I'd do is kind of show you how to start holding your team accountable with 4 easy steps that any leader can take. So let's get into it. Number 1, step 1 is you have to introduce your expectations if you haven't already. So this is step 1. You cannot hold someone accountable for something they didn't know. I had a bad boss who did this once, and it was absolutely ridiculous. He just assumed that I knew what I was expected to do, and he was holding me accountable to things that we had never talked about. So don't be like my bad boss. Make sure that if you have expectations, that you share those and you introduce those to the person on your team that you're holding accountable. Here's what I expect. Here's when I expect it. Here's how I expect you to approach it, and make sure that that's clear. And that's step 2, ensuring that your employee actually understands and is capable of meeting those expectations. So sometimes leaders hold their team accountable before they're even sure they're able to meet those standards. And so what that could be is maybe you have an employee that they have the motivation. They want to be good. They want to meet this expectation, but they just have never done it before. They didn't go to school for it. They never learned it on the job. No, their boss has covered it with them before. So if you just go in there, share your expectations, and assume that they're capable of meeting them, you're going to be setting them up for failure, and you're going to be setting yourself up for failure. So I always think it's really important that when you're introducing those expectations, that you're checking for understanding and you're making sure that the employee is actually capable of meeting the expectations. So, when you're in the moment with that employee, that could be as simple as asking them, hey, are you comfortable with this? Does this make sense? Do you feel like you have the tools necessary to do that? And hopefully you built up enough trust where they can be honest and say, hey, I don't actually know how to do that. So I'm glad you asked. Can you show me how? Dude, when an employee asked me that, I was like, no problem at all. Happy to show you. That's my pleasure. That's my job. Moving on, I think step 3 is really important, which is following up regularly. So again, accountability is not infrequent. You can't just say something one time and expect that your team is going to remember it, make it important, and run with it. And so, whether you review stuff during a one-on-one, whether you do independent validation, or you simply ask, you need to inspect what you expect. And this is the step where most people fail. Right? They think, hey, if I just talk to my employee that one time, I tell them what I need from them, gosh, they should just do it, right? Well, unfortunately, that's just not how humans work, right? We forget stuff. We deprioritize stuff. We get lost in something else that's more important at that moment. So it really takes a boss, a leader, to follow up and say, hey, we talked about this a couple of months ago. We talked about this 2 weeks ago. I want to see how it's going. What are you struggling with? And what can I do to help? And, obviously course correcting, which is step 4, make adjustments as needed. When an employee isn't meeting your expectations, you need to tell them. So don't just assume that they're going to figure it out. Don't become bitter and resentful that, hey, they didn't follow up on this like they should have. That's not their job. That's your job. So when an employee isn't meeting expectations, tell them, and then ask them why. Why is it that they're not meeting those expectations? Have they forgotten them? Did they not think they were important to begin with? Is it a skill issue? Something that you can teach and help them grow? Or is it a will issue? They just don't think it's important, so they're not going to make it important. And I think it's really important that you make those adjustments and you find out what's going on. So again, step 1, introduce the expectations. Step 2, ensure that the employee understands and is capable of meeting the expectations. Step 3, you got to follow up regularly, inspect what you expect. And step 4, make adjustments as needed. When they're not hitting those expectations, tell them, ask them why, and then come up with a good follow-up plan to ensure they meet those expectations and then follow up on that. So those are like 4 really, really easy ways to start. I know it might seem a little uncomfortable if you haven't done that before, but I will say this too, just on a personal note, if you don't make this a big deal as you're introducing it and holding someone accountable, the employee won't feel like it's a big deal. And when I say big deal, I mean that in a negative thing. If you make this some big thing, hey team, I want to have a meeting with you and I'm going to hold you accountable and it's going to be really intense. And if you don't, there's going to be consequences. That's making it a big deal. But if it's more simple of like, hey, here are the things that we got to do as a team. I want to make sure you know how to do them. I'm going to be following up with you to make sure that you get them done. And if you get stuck at any point, let me know. That's what my job is, to make sure that I help you get to the next step, right? So really, really easy 4 steps that I'm positive will work because I've tried them. So what I want to do now, transition slightly and talk a little bit about how to actually handle pushback if you have an employee that doesn't want to be held accountable. So, again, we don't live in a perfect world. And sometimes you're going to encounter an employee who doesn't agree with or like the expectations. Maybe they think they could do it better. And maybe they don't think it's important. Maybe they don't respect you. Maybe they don't trust you. I don't know what the reason would be, but there are going to be times where you're going to have an employee that's going to be giving you pushback. And so, I'll sit here and tell you that has absolutely happened to me. So, just because I have this podcast and I was a leader for over a decade does not mean I didn't struggle with these kind of things, does not mean I had perfect teams every single time. I had tons of teams that had varying level of pushback and people who didn't agree with stuff. So a couple things that I have done in the past that I think could really help you when it comes to handling pushback around accountability is a few things. So number 1 is I think it's really important that when you are going through a situation like this, that you're connecting whatever the expectation is to their why, to the team why, or the company why. And so what do I mean by that? The why is why they get up and do what they do. The team why is why it exists. The company why is it there to serve its customers. So anytime I want something to do something that they don't want to do, I try to connect it to a why. So instead of it just saying like, hey, this is what Austin wants, this is like, no, this is what I said was important to me as a human. I want to help people. Okay. Or this was what we agreed to as a team when we created this vision, or we all work for this company and the company's why, like, this is why we're here. So if like, we don't want to connect to our why, if we don't want to connect to our team why or our company why, like maybe, I don't know, maybe this isn't a good fit, right? A lot of times though, people will latch onto that, right? They'll realize, oh my gosh, that is true. Like I did say I wanted to become the best version of myself, or oh my gosh, I did say I wanted to help our customers, with whatever problem. And so then they'll realize, okay, maybe I will start doing that expectation that my boss talked about. So again, I think it's important to connect it to something different. That's really how humans operate, right? We're much more likely to latch on something and to go further with it if we realize there's something bigger at stake. If it's just like, hey, this is some rule I want you to follow, some arbitrary rule, like, I mean, maybe they'll follow it. Maybe that'll work for a little bit, but when things get tough or when other priorities pop up, that's going to be the first thing to go. So again, I think it's really important. Connect to their why, the team why, the company why. Another one is show what's in it for them. So explain to them why they should care about it and how it would help their career. So I had lots of times where an employee would be like, dude, Austin, I don't want to do this. Like, I don't want to make these calls, or like, gosh, I don't want to have to like review all this paperwork. And I would say like, hey man, I get it. It sucks. Like it's not necessarily the most fun thing to do, but like, here's why I think you should care. Like if we don't make these calls to our clients, then how are we going to expect to grow our team, right? Like how are we going to hit the goals that we all said were important to us? Or like you said, you don't want to review your paperwork. I get it. You're not an operations girl and it's like not your favorite thing to do, but like, here's what's at stake if we don't review our paperwork. Like it could put the team in jeopardy. It could hurt our clients in some way. So that goes into the third one is like be direct, but be specific on what's at stake. And sometimes you need to like tease the consequences or negatives that will happen if your employee doesn't meet your expectations. And I don't think you should lead with this. In fact, I think this should be the last resort because most people you're not going to have to threaten consequences and the negatives. And again, not threaten, just tease it out. So like, hey Johnny, like I get it. You don't want to review your paperwork, but like, as you know, this is on your scorecard. So, I want to make sure at the end of the quarter that you look good and that you are set up in the best position for a raise or for promotion. And like, this is what's at stake if we don't do that. That could really hurt you in your career. That could actually prevent you from hitting those career goals that you set. So again, I don't think it's ever good to lead with, the negative. I'm always a fan of like going with the positive first, but in those rare cases where you just got someone who's hard-headed or who doesn't want to listen or quite frankly, wasn't maybe a good fit for the team, you might have to pull that out if necessary and just tease, touch on the consequences or negatives that could happen if your employee doesn't meet those expectations. And if I haven't said this already, I want to make sure it's really, really clear. Be very, very intentional on what your expectations are. I want you to put yourself in the shoes of the employee. I want you to think about the bigger picture. And if it's not ultimately super important for the business, I don't think you need to be spending a lot of time making that an expectation. Like, I'll give you an example. Maybe it's a bad example. Maybe you disagree. But like for me, we had a work that quote unquote started at 8 a.m. and ended at 5 for a lot of employees that I managed. They wouldn't a lot of times have meetings first thing in the morning. And so like if they were 5 or 10 minutes late, I didn't give a shit. I really didn't. And, again, maybe that's a bad thing. Maybe you disagree, but here's how I viewed it. It didn't affect their customers. It didn't affect our team. And like, we're human beings. Like, I'm not here to babysit you. If you're 5 or 10 minutes late, like, I'm not worried about it. You're going to get your work done either way. I've hired you to do a job. And so I say that to just like put this on the top of your head is like, your expectations need to make sense. They need to be fair, and you need to be thinking about the end in mind. Don't just make up a whole bunch of expectations and make it a team of just intense accountability just because you want to have control. Control at the expense of autonomy is not a good thing for your employees, okay? So really important there. So, I want to transition a little bit and talk about accountability in remote teams. So, we're living in a new world where teams are spread out, right? We're not all working in the same building. And, in fact, I spent the last 5 years of my corporate career managing remote teams nationwide. And, I will tell you, this was new to me and it came with some challenges. At first, for the first 10 years of my career, I managed everybody in person at the same building. And so I was able to keep my eyes on people and course correct much easier. But once I realized I was going to be managing teams across the US, I was like, dude, I gotta change some stuff up. I gotta make sure I got this, set up the right way. Otherwise, this could get out of hand. So a couple things that I've done that I think could really help you is, number one, you got to hire the right people up front. You would be surprised how much drama you can avoid, how much wasted time you can avoid, and just uncomfortability you can avoid by simply hiring the right people. So I released an episode about hiring in the past, so I'm not going to go into a ton of detail, but remember, everything starts with hiring the right people. The people that fit your culture, the people that have the right values, the people that treat their customers the right way, the people that understand what's important and what's not important. You got to find those right people. And if you hire the right people up front, you are going to avoid a ton of these issues. In fact, if you hire the right people up front, you may not even have to have these intense accountability talks or even make it a big deal because they're just there to do their job. They understand what's expected of them. And they're just like, dude, yeah, I'm going to do it. Like, you hired me to do it. I'm going to do it. And that's my favorite employee. So I say that as a warning. Take time up front. Hire the right people. Figure out what's important to you, what you need, what are your non-negotiables. Interview them, have a conversation with them as a real human being, look at them in the eyes, figure out what they're all about. And then if they're the right people, hire them. And then, you're off to the races. Another one that I think is really important is leading with trust. I've said it many times on the podcast, and I'm going to say it till I'm blue in the face. If you give your people trust to get the job done and then get out of their way, you are going to see amazing results. Only step in when needed. too much accountability can move into micromanaging. I've said that a couple of times, and I think it's important. Give your trust freely and watch as your team steps up. I got to tell you, I've seen this in action many times. I've hired the right people, told them what I expected of them, and I just gave them my trust, even before we had worked together a long time. I learned that from Gary Vee years ago about just giving trust, and I realized, that really works. And so when you give your people trust, it's funny. They're adults and they start acting like it. Like they'll just step up. They'll do the things. You don't have to tell them. If you give your team trust and you literally say and show them in your actions that, hey, I hired you. I know you're capable of this and I don't need to watch you do it. Dude, such power in that. My goodness. If your team knows that you trust them and that you are going to just let them do their thing, oh my goodness, you're going to watch your team grow and just take on bigger and bigger challenges, and they are going to hold each other accountable and they are going to step up. And so I think that's the last one that I want to transition to is I think it's super important that you're focusing on the end goal and less on how you get there. And that goes perfectly with that trust and autonomy. And I've seen too many leaders focus on controlling how stuff gets done versus the result. So, you could go in and manage a team where you make every single thing an expectation and you hold them accountable and it's intense. And you might think, gosh, dude, that control's good. I'm going to make sure that I get the results because I'm going to be watching every single little thing. And that just doesn't work because everyone on your team does stuff differently. So if I treat everyone the same and hold them accountable for the exact same way to do stuff, it's not going to turn into something good because some people are going to be like, this is not how I work or this is not how I learn. And you're making me do it the exact same way as Tony, but I'm Sarah and I'm different from Tony. So like treat me like Sarah and treat Tony like Tony. And I think that's really important is if you're focusing on the big picture, you're not going to be as worried about the minutia and the micro stuff, right? And I'm not saying to ignore what's important or your expectations. I'm just saying keep your eyes on what really matters. Is your goal to just be there to hold your team accountable? Or is your goal to do some really cool shit as a team? If your goal is to do some cool stuff as a team, that's what you should be focusing on. All the little stuff, it's all going to take care of itself, right? And again, too much control is definitely a bad thing. So you can go too far. I will say that. So what I want to do now is transition a little bit before we tell you a story about accountability. And I just want to, I don't want to scare you. I don't want to, get you all worked up here. That's not my goal today, but I do want to tell you what could happen when you don't have any accountability in a team. And there's no bueno, folks. There's some bad stuff. So, I've worked in teams where there isn't accountability and pardon my language, it's a fucking disaster. It's like the wild, wild west. Everyone's out for themselves. Some people work hard, others don't. And here are the three biggest risks that I've seen when leaders don't hold their teams accountable. So number one, resentment. High performers want to be around other high performers. So when you have a bad apple on a team who's getting away with stuff, the rest of the team starts to feel resentment. They're going to resent their coworker for being lazy, for not doing the stuff they need to, and then they're also going to resent you for not doing your job. So when you hold your team accountable, you're actually showing them that the work matters. That's really, really important. So if they see that you care about it and that it's important, then they're going to think it's important and they're going to care. So if you don't want to have resentment on your team and you don't want to piss your people off, you need to hold everybody accountable. That's really important. You don't pick and choose. You don't play favorites. Everybody is held accountable for everything that goes on in the team. And that's another big thing too, is like, I don't want to say like employees will self-govern themselves, but in a way they kind of do. If like you make it clear that everyone's accountable for what happens in the team, you're going to notice that the higher performers are going to make sure that the lower performers do a better job. And they're not going to leave anybody behind. So I think that's really important as well. A little bit of a tangent, but I thought I'd share it with you. I think another big risk of leaders who don't hold their team accountable is, there's lackluster results. So when there isn't proper accountability on your team, results aren't going to be good because people are going to cut corners. They're going to focus on the wrong stuff. They're going to waste time. They're going to pursue things that don't make sense. And accountability really drives performance. People need to know what they are doing matters, and they need to know what's expected of them. So imagine you have a team and they don't really know what's important or to focus on. So they're going to just make up what they think is important and they're going to focus on that. And then at the end of the year, you're going to find that maybe your team of 10, they were all pursuing different things. So if everyone's going in 10 different directions, you don't have any unity. You don't have any consistency, which is the third one, which is there's not going to be consistency between teammates. And you may have heard this before, but your team is the sum of its parts. You may have some rock stars, but chances are you're going to have varying levels of employees. So if you pick and choose to hold your employees accountable, you lower the team's overall effectiveness. And I'm sure you've heard the common term that your team is only as good as your weakest link. And I know it's cheesy and you probably roll your eyes when you hear it, but it's the truth. If you have some low performers that aren't being held accountable and you have some high performers that are being held accountable, what do you think the overall standard of the team is? It's going to be much lower because there's some people that aren't doing the shit they need to do. So do your best to get the best, even from your weakest links, by holding them accountable. I have watched my weak links turn into my power rock stars, and it's definitely doable. It takes a little more hand-holding. It takes you being shoulder to shoulder. It takes a little bit of trust in the process, but you can definitely turn your weakest links into some rock stars. And I think one way to do that is holding them accountable. Here's what I need you to work on. Here's how I need you to do it. I'm going to follow up with you. I want to make sure it gets done. I want to make sure you get promoted. I want to help you get to the next step. Like, that's my job. And I'll tell you, those are some big, big things to watch out for. So if you're in a team and you're not holding your team accountable, or you work on a team and your boss isn't holding their team accountable, there's some risks: resentment, lackluster results, and a lack of consistency. And I don't want that for you. I want you to have no resentment. I want you to have consistent, amazing results. And I want anyone who comes into your team and looks at the other 10 people to say, dude, we got a whole bunch of rock stars. Like, everybody's kind of at the same level a little bit. That's what I want for you. So, don't be like some of those bad managers. Make sure you hold your team accountable. I think it's so stinking important. And what I thought I'd do is actually wrap up by telling you a little story, could kind of bring it all together. So this is a story about a friend of mine. He actually worked for a small accounting firm. It had about 4 employees, I think, including the owner. And the owner was a super nice guy. Like, clients loved the owner. The business looked solid from the outside. And so my friend, started with the firm as the operations manager, and everything initially seemed, again, really good. Everybody got along and the work was going pretty good. But then a few months later, my buddy calls me up and he was like, dude, I want to chat about like how things are going. He's like, things are looking a little weird. And he started to notice that while the boss was nice, the team wasn't effective. Deadlines were being missed, lack of consistency, and the boss always seemed stressed. And so, the boss actually met with my friend on a weekly basis. And most of the time, the meetings were actually just the boss complaining about the team. People weren't doing what he wanted, when he wanted it, how he wanted it. The team weren't meeting his expectations. But the funny thing is, the boss had never told his expectations and never held anybody accountable. So he bitched and complained to my friend. Things weren't going well, but he had never done his job as a leader. And, at first my friend didn't think much of this. He just, assumed the boss was just venting and that he would take care of chatting with the team. But then months passed and the boss was still nice, but he kept complaining. And eventually my buddy was like, all right, dude, I had enough. So he actually encouraged his boss to chat with the team. So he was like, dude, you gotta just tell the team what you want from us. Like, we're happy to do it, but we don't know what you want. And, it just kept going round and round and round. And the boss kept making excuses. Like, they should already know what I expect of them. Or, oh yeah, I plan to chat with them next quarter, during the review, or like, hey, I don't want to come down too hard on them. Right. And each time though, avoiding what mattered, accountability. He was nervous what the team would think. He didn't want to have the quote unquote hard conversation with them. And unfortunately, my friend eventually had enough and he just left, man. He quit because this wasn't a team. This wasn't a culture that was moving in the right direction. And this is exactly what can happen when there isn't accountability in a team. Good people leave, results stay poor, and time is wasted. And unfortunately, his boss never realized that accountability isn't necessarily a bad thing. It's actually a necessary thing for any team trying to make an impact. So if I could leave you with anything before our challenges, I want you to just realize that accountability is not a boogeyman. It's not a scary thing. It's not a bad thing. It's what we need as employees and leaders to help the people around us get better results and do cool shit. We can't just assume that people know what to do and just assume that they're going to figure it out on their own. As a leader, your job is to set those expectations and to hold them accountable to them. You don't have to be an asshole to hold people accountable. You don't have to be mean. You don't have to make it a big deal, but you do have to do it. You do have to have that conversation. So it takes a little confidence up front to have that conversation to hold your team accountable, but watch what happens as you do that. You're going to notice that your team moves further and they move faster. So leaders, here's what my challenge is for you this week. I want to review your team. Are you avoiding holding people accountable? Are there some people on your team that you like, but you're just not holding accountable because you like them? Are you scared to have tough convos? If so, and you want to dip your toe into the accountability pool, I want you to start small and share one expectation with the team. Then I want you to follow up. And if you do that, I'm confident you're going to see success. And you know what would be really cool, just to pull it all together? Send me an email. Like if you've tried this and something's working, I would love to get your feedback. And even if that means I can give you some advice or tips, like totally down to do that as well. Again, my email is theintrovertleader@gmail.com. But I want to say thank you so much for listening. Thank you so much for tuning in today. Make it a great day. This has been the Introvert Leader Podcast. Subscribe for new episodes every other Wednesday.